Welcome to the 2014 Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare Learning Module titled A Review of Refugee Involvement in the Child Welfare System, Recommendations, Tools, and Promising Practices. After completing this learning module, participants will be familiar with relevant literature related to refugee families' involvement with child welfare, understand common barriers faced by refugee families in interacting with child welfare, understand common challenges that child welfare workers face in working with refugee families, and be familiar with tools and promising practices for working with refugee families. Please take a moment to review this slide, which presents an overview of this learning module. Before we get started, this slide presents a brief review of important terms. First, the term refugee refers to a legal immigration status. Refugee status is initial and temporary. People who come to the U.S. as refugees are able to adjust their immigration status after 1 year to legal permanent resident, and after 5 years they are eligible to apply for U.S. citizenship. Once they achieve one of these two immigration statuses, they are no longer referred to as refugees. Refugees are people who have fled persecution or who had a well-founded fear of being persecuted based on one of 5 factors: their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or their membership in a particular social group. Over the past 10 years, the largest numbers of people to come to Minnesota as refugees have included people from Somalia, Hmong people from Laos, Karen and other ethnic minorities from Burma, Ethiopia, including Oromo people, Liberia, Bhutan, Iraq, and former Soviet Union countries. They speak many different languages, and major religions include Islam, Hinduism, animism or shamanism, Buddhism, and Christianity. Lastly, while child welfare workers are likely to interact with families who are facing many challenges, it is important to remember that most immigrant and refugee families will face challenges, but will eventually integrate successfully. Part 1. What do we know about refugees in the child welfare system? There is limited research that describes refugees' involvement in the child welfare system. Limited research exists on how many immigrant or refugee children are involved in child welfare, or the reasons for their involvement. Because administrative data do not routinely identify the nativity of parents and their children, and these fields are often optional and rarely filled out. Limited research also exists on the barriers that refugees and immigrants face in interacting with the child welfare system. The outcomes of service interventions for families from refugee backgrounds. There is a lack of voices of refugee parents represented in the literature. And finally, most research that does exist focuses on the involvement of African American, Asian and Pacific Islander, Mexican, and Native American populations in the child welfare system. Current evidence suggests that there is an overrepresentation of racial and ethnic minorities, broadly speaking, in the child welfare system, and this has been acknowledged as a problem. Western parenting models and services that are designed for and by the host society majority group may not bring positive outcomes for refugee families, because they do not consider cultural, migratory, and resettlement experiences that are critical for understanding, serving, and meeting the needs of families from refugee backgrounds. In order to serve refugee families appropriately, services and systems must be adapted to the diverse social and cultural contexts of the families being served. It is important to remember that the conversation about refugees in the child welfare system takes place in a broader societal context. Scholars such as Dumbrill have pointed out that refugees are generally portrayed in a negative way in society, social service systems, and the social work literature. Child welfare professionals are also exposed to these messages. Dumbrill points out that refugees face negative, prejudicial, and sometimes hostile societal attitudes towards them. For example, overuse of the term refugee, especially as families become citizens and integrated members of this society, continues to emphasize their displacement and lack of belonging, rather than emphasizing their strengths, resilience, and their process of integration into their new home. The term refugee also conjures up images of passive victims, and again reinforces a discourse of deficits rather than focusing on their strengths. Finally, refugees are often portrayed or treated as a burden on society. It is important for anyone working with people from refugee backgrounds to understand this broader context, which shapes the everyday experiences of their clients from refugee backgrounds. In order for child welfare professionals to appropriately assess claims of abuse and work with families from refugee backgrounds, it is important to understand the underlying family conflict in its cultural, migration, and resettlement context. This section will focus on those areas. As you listen to and read this case vignette, think about how this family's culture, migration, and acculturation context may be impacting their family functioning. As I read the vignette, you may want to take notes as we will be coming back to the details of this story throughout the rest of the module. A consultation was requested by Child Protection Services for Farah, a 15-year-old Middle Eastern girl who had recently immigrated with her parents and siblings. Farah's family had left their home because of political instability. Her father, who was a surgeon, was unable to pursue his profession because of non-recognition of the equivalence of his medical training and diploma in the U.S. Consequently, Farah's mother had to work to help support the family, and she also managed to find a low-wage job for her husband in the grocery store where she worked. Farah, the 15-year-old girl, quickly adapted to her new school and social environment and became increasingly demanding of autonomy and independence within the family. She often accused her parents of being too strict and still living in their home country in their hearts, in comparison to her friends' parents. The family atmosphere became very tense as the family experienced financial, social, and psychological strain. On one occasion, Farah's father noticed that she had drunk alcohol, which was forbidden according to the family's religion and cultural values. This provoked a serious confrontation that ended with Farah being hit by her father. When Farah shared this event with her friends at school, they spoke with a school counselor, and CPS was alerted. Her parents were shocked by the involvement of the CPS and felt both shamed and powerless. They reacted angrily by refusing any cooperation with the CPS professionals and accused Farah of dishonoring the family. Her mother, who stood by her father, was described by the CPS professionals as being submissive. They warned the father that they would not tolerate his aggressive and authoritarian manner. Based on CPS recommendations as well as Farah's request, the court ordered her placement in a foster family for 24 months and gave authority over her activity to the foster family. Farah was allowed to call home once a week, but visits with her family, including her siblings, were withheld until the parents cooperated more fully with the agency. Over the ensuing months, Farah's health significantly deteriorated. She became depressed, lost her appetite, and had disturbed sleep, as well as suicidal thoughts. At this point, CPS requested cultural consultation and psychological assessment. Resettlement to a new culture, especially one with different cultural norms, is challenging. It often requires renegotiation of familiar family roles, requires parents to adapt their child-rearing practices, and requires parents to learn new social norms, values, and expectations. Sometimes these values, norms, and expectations may conflict with those of their home culture. This slide presents an overview of some of the cultural norms that may be different, unfamiliar, or even conflict with the home cultures of people from refugee backgrounds. Appropriate discipline often refers to the appropriate use of physical punishment for instructing and disciplining children. Physical discipline may be more common in other cultures and viewed as a means of keeping children safe, with more strict discipline being used when parents believe that a child is in greater danger. Even in cultures that utilize physical punishment more often, there are still boundaries between appropriate and inappropriate punishment. The authors Ima and Holm have described Asian and Pacific Islander parents as expressing amazement that parents in the U.S. have limited rights to physically punish their children. Vietnamese parents, specifically, report being raised in this way, seeing this as shaping a child's character, and seeing punishment as the proper way to condition children and instill morals. However, there are still appropriate boundaries that define appropriate and inappropriate physical punishment. For example, losing control or beating a child like an animal would be considered culturally shameful. Physical punishment in these cultures is viewed as a means of keeping children safe, with more strict discipline being used when parents believe a child is in greater danger. Other cultural norms that may be different include parenting styles and expectation, understanding of appropriate or effective medical treatment, and child supervision. Different cultural contexts call for different models of caring for children. For example, you may be familiar with the saying, "It takes a village to raise a child." Parents accustomed to this model of parenting supervision may struggle with U.S. supervision requirements or view them as being excessively watchful. They may also have different beliefs about how young children can be in order to care for their younger siblings or infants. In the context of U.S. child welfare agencies, this may be considered inadequate supervision and a category of neglect. Child welfare agencies may also disapprove of multiple families living together, which may be normal in a different cultural context. These are all areas where offering information and education to families from refugee backgrounds may be important. This slide includes quotes from parents who are describing the impact of not being able to rely on their traditional parenting practices once they move to the U.S. When we get here, we become frustrated that our way of doing things back home can't be implemented on this side of the world because it's just all so different. We can't bring our children up our way. Here, a 10-year-old would act like a 4-year-old. If you tell them not to do something, they'll always do it. Back home, if you have a 10-year-old, most of the time they will act like adults because they are disciplined to know right and wrong. My children are growing up and learning the ways of a different society, and I see that my children have grown up to have no respect. We feel our children are out of our hands. Additionally, acculturation factors can also destabilize a family system. This slide presents several acculturation factors that families from refugee backgrounds may be dealing with. First, they face the challenge of renegotiating cultural, ethnic, and religious identities. They may have to face changing gender roles, role reversal, erosion of parental authority, which results from role reversal, intergenerational conflicts, and loss of support networks, such as family or community. These are all factors that can destabilize the family system, and that child welfare workers should be aware of in working with families from refugee backgrounds. Acculturation factors and resettlement-related challenges may be things that families have not had to deal with in the past. For example, threats by children to report abuse may be used to manipulate their family members, which also contributes to a culture of fear about child protective services. Also, families may have experienced protracted separations between parents and children as a result of their displacement and the resettlement process. These families may face especially unique challenges. Going back to the case vignette, please take a few moments to think about what are some of the ways that differing cultural norms and the acculturation process may have been affecting the dynamics in Farah's case. Here are a few examples of the way that these factors may have been affecting Farah's case. The family was experiencing changing roles and authority, with the children integrating more quickly into their new society and becoming familiar with their new environment. They were also adopting new values and beliefs that differed from their home culture. Farah's desire for independence and money was perceived by her parents as threats to cultural identity and challenges to their cultural and religious values. Also, Farah's parents and all family members were facing multiple losses, including loss of their homeland, Farah's father's loss of professional identity, parental authority, and that their culture and religion were perceived as being threatened by their new society. These are just some of the ways that differing cultural norms and the acculturation process may have been affecting Farah's family. Again, please take a few moments to think about and jot down ideas to answer this question. How might the CPS worker's own values have interfered with her work with this family? How might the CPS worker's own values have interfered with her assessment, understanding, or intervention with this family? The authors of this vignette point out that the CPS workers' values of individualism and autonomy may have conflicted with the family's value for obedience of children and a more communal understanding of dependence on one's family. Second, the CPS professional interpreted Farah's father's cultural authority as authoritarian and aggressive, whereas this behavior was appropriate within Farah's cultural context. Other areas where norms and values differed between Farah's home culture and the culture of the CPS worker include values around gender norms and religious values. This is how the author of this vignette described the actions of the CPS professional. CPS workers were outraged by the possibility that Farah's parents' restrictions on her behavior were motivated by culturally and religiously based gender norms, congruent with their wish to raise her to be an obedient and dependent member of her family, rather than independent and assertive. The CPS workers believed that Farah's parents were too strict and her father was too authoritarian. Moreover, they felt that Farah was resisting pressure to be submissive and that, as professionals, they had a responsibility to assist her in her efforts at autonomy. This is how the authors of the vignette portray the family's perspective. Feeling completely betrayed, powerless, unable to fight the institution or make their voices heard, Farah's parents' self-protective reaction was to reject her. Though this action was motivated by anger and desperation, it was perceived by the CPS workers as being rigid and rejecting of their daughter. Another layer of challenges affecting Farah's family and other families from refugee backgrounds include resettlement challenges. These include systematic barriers to stable employment and loss of occupational status. A former refugee described loss of occupational status in this way: "My husband was like these businessmen. He was a civil engineer. He went to university and has lots of work experience, but here he is a technician. We were middle class in our country, but we became the lowest class here. It affects our family, the kids, your emotions, and behavior." Other resettlement challenges facing families from refugee backgrounds include poverty, difficulty securing adequate housing, and discrimination and racism. Although immigrant and refugee families face these risk factors related to poverty, lack of health care, and family problems, they also face systematic barriers to accessing the services that they need to address these problems before they reach a crisis. In other words, they are less likely to know where to go for help. And they face barriers to accessing health and social services when needed. Language represents a huge barrier for refugees and immigrants with limited English proficiency. One woman described her experience facing language barriers within the child welfare and legal system in this way: "In the courts, sometimes there is no one to translate. You cannot talk to your attorney because none of them speak your language. They just say, 'Do this, sign this.' I have no idea what was going on, except that my case took so long, almost 5 months, and then suddenly, when we saw the judge, they gave the children back to me. No one ever explained to me what happened." Immigrants and refugees may also have different norms regarding the roles of institutions. For example, they may be unfamiliar with state intervention into what they consider private family matters. Second, when trusted institutions, such as a school, become informers of child protection cases, parents may be confused or feel even more vulnerable. Finally, refugees in particular are in the U.S. because they've faced persecution by government authorities. Having fled persecution at the hands of government officials, refugees may perceive state officials as dangerous and respond with fear and distrust. One Guatemalan mother, whose experience with child welfare in the U.S. started when the police were called to her home to intervene in a domestic dispute, described her experience in this way: "In my country, when someone from the government knocks on your door, a family member disappears. I came to this country to give my children a better life, but they don't see that. All they see is someone who doesn't speak English, who doesn't know anything, and they think we must be bad people who don't care about our families. They came and took my daughter, and they did nothing to help me." Please take a few minutes to think about or jot down ideas about what are specific examples of how resettlement challenges that have been presented in the previous slides may be affecting Farah's family. One resettlement challenge the family was facing was a significant change in their social and economic status. Farah's father was unable to continue in his career as a surgeon because of different credentialing requirements here in the U.S. His wife was forced to work outside of the home for the first time, and she was the one who found her husband work in a low-skilled, low-paying job. Being separated from their home country and their social networks, the family was facing social exclusion in their new environment. Also, the family experienced powerlessness and helplessness in relation to the child protective system, which they did not understand, and they were also struggling to have their own culture and values understood. These are just a few of many examples of how resettlement challenges affected this family. Refugees, who have often faced persecution, trauma, and sometimes torture, may be struggling with unresolved mental health problems, either related to pre-migration traumas or related to the stress of resettling in a new culture. This includes anxiety and depressive symptoms, sleep disturbance, and physical symptoms. Again, both from their experiences before they migrated and as well as after they migrated to the U.S. And multiple losses, including their homes, possessions, the value of their education, family members, and cultural familiarity. Recall that this area is addressed in more detail in Learning Module 1. This slide just presents a quick review. Take a few minutes to think about what are specific examples of how mental health problems may be influencing different members of Farah's family, including Farah, her mother, and her father. Farah was facing difficulties negotiating two cultures, and once placed in foster care, she faced isolation from her family and culture, as well as a disconnection to the familiar. Farah's mother was facing anxiety, depression, and powerlessness associated with losing her daughter, worrying about her other children, as well as financial difficulties. Farah's father was feeling failure and shame about not being able to provide for their family, as well as anxiety, depression, and powerlessness associated with losing his daughter, and also worrying about the future of his other children. In the end, Farah's parents' disinvestment in her and acceptance that authority for her had been transferred to the foster family ultimately was a response to disempowerment and a concern about protecting their younger children. In other words, feeling completely powerless and unable to fight the institution that had taken their daughter or make their voices heard, Farah's parents' self-protective reaction was to reject her. This slide presents the outcome of Farah's case. First, the CPS worker requested cultural consultation. The cultural consultant recommended mediation services between Farah and her parents. Also, the CPS worker explored the parents' sense of betrayal, powerlessness, and lack of agency. The family's sense of empowerment and participation in the decisions that affect their own and their child's future was restored. Finally, visits were reestablished between Farah and her siblings to reconnect her to her religion, culture, and language. This section describes common challenges that are faced by child welfare professionals in working with refugee families. Bridging Refugee Youth and Children's Services, or BRYCS, held community conversations with child welfare professionals who raised the following concerns. First, they expressed challenges related to a shortage of bilingual, bicultural staff members and interpretation and translation services at all levels in the system, including hotline workers, social workers, psychologists, child welfare workers, and attorneys. They also described that a lack of background information about refugee status and benefits, adjustment challenges, effects of trauma, family system, and refugee community resources presented challenges for them in being able to work effectively with refugee families. Language barriers and issues associated with working with interpreters present many challenges for child welfare workers in working with families from refugee backgrounds. First, communication problems and lack of appropriate translation services can lead to inaccurate or insufficient information about a case. There are numerous problems associated with using children, family members, or neighbors to interpret. Some of these challenges include serious confidentiality issues, untrained interpreters who may consciously or unconsciously filter or censor what is said or give inaccurate information. And finally, using a child to interpret risks potentially further traumatizing the child. This section presents recommendations, tools, and promising practices for child welfare workers working with families from refugee backgrounds. This slide presents points for child welfare agencies to consider when working with refugee and immigrant families. First, always make interpreters available. Do not use minors as interpreters. Address families' immediate crises and concerns so that they can concentrate on the issues that led to their involvement with Child Protective Services. Within an agency, promote hiring of bilingual and bicultural staff. Develop programs and services to meet the specific needs of refugee families. And conduct outreach and education to refugee communities about the Child Protective Services process. Culturally competent practice is required for working with families from refugee backgrounds. Culturally competent practice includes being knowledgeable about refugee backgrounds and their experiences, cultural values, client strengths, indigenous help-seeking and receiving behaviors, local refugee services and resources, and finally, cultural humility, which emphasizes the importance of continual learning and engaging each family as individuals, and not developing stereotypes. Learning about another culture is a lifelong process and requires being constantly open to learning new information from each family that you work with. This slide includes several resources to ensure that daily social work practice incorporates principles of cultural competence. Please take a moment to review these resources. Culturally competent practice includes being knowledgeable about migration histories and stories and the effects of migration and acculturation on families' functioning. Culturally competent intakes include information about migration experiences, cultural values, and cultural norms. Cultural consultants can provide safe, non-judgmental spaces for child protection workers to reflect on their roles and on their interventions with families who are coming from different cultures. Cultural consultants are able to develop a double alliance with the family and with the child protection and legal services actors, which can facilitate communication and understanding about complex family and institutional situations. In order to identify family strengths, child protection workers can begin by asking about any concerns the parents have for their children and ascertaining how the parents are currently responding to these concerns. Refugee families have a number of strengths that can be used to facilitate positive outcomes. For instance, parents have endured extraordinary circumstances to protect their children and families and bring their children to a safe place. Child welfare workers can recognize and reinforce these strengths with the parents with whom they work. The Assessment of Immigration Dynamics, or AID Guide, is a strengths-based assessment tool. It provides a series of stimulus questions that can be used in preventive or interventive child welfare services to explore immigration-related and systematic factors that may have contributed to a child's risk and/or the family's capacity to protect and nurture. The AID Guide asks about migration, arrival, and settlement experiences, current experiences, and future life. Some examples of questions that appear in the AID Guide include: tell me who you were back in your country. Tell me about growing up in your country. What was life like for you before you left? Who made the decision about migration and why? What were your expectations in coming here? This slide presents a broader framework of the AID Guide. Please take a few minutes to think about how you might apply this guide to Farah's case, or how it might have been useful. This slide presents a few ideas about how you might apply this framework to Farah's case, or how it might have been useful. First, the guide could be used to assist with the family assessment. It could be useful to help understand the family's culture. It could be used to assist with rapport and alliance building with the family. It could help the child welfare worker to understand each family member's stressors that may be destabilizing the family, as well as to understand the underlying emotional and mental health problems that family members are experiencing. Finally, it could be used to help identify and provide appropriate supports or referrals to meet the family's immediate needs. Much of the research on refugees in the child welfare system suggests that child welfare systems should develop collaborations with ethnic community-based agencies. These community-based agencies can ensure that services are provided in a culturally and linguistically appropriate manner and can help raise awareness within refugee communities about child protective services. Another recommendation is for child welfare services to develop cross-service collaborations. In other words, form interdisciplinary teams for working with refugees and immigrants. These teams could include child welfare system workers, service providers, legal and law enforcement officers, courts, educational institutions or schools, substance abuse programs, traditional healers, and mental health services. Multidisciplinary teams are best suited to address the diverse needs that may be facing refugee families as they adjust to their new culture and environment. Bridging Refugee Youth and Children's Services conducted a pilot cross-service training in order to strengthen collaboration between child welfare and refugee service agencies. As a result of this collaboration, there was increased access to interpreters, cultural information, culturally similar foster families, and linguistically and culturally appropriate support services for refugee families. Additionally, refugee service organizations can provide mental health, parenting education, anger management, and other social services to address family conflict and prevent the need to remove a child. Another recommendation is to develop specialized services for serving refugee families. For example, dedicate staff or a bilingual unit to specialize in working with immigrant or refugee families, or develop a service contract with a community-based agency to provide these services. Another idea is to create a migrant specialist position in the child welfare system to work specifically with immigrant and refugee populations, and direct the training and education of child welfare case managers. This person could also be someone who could focus on developing cross-system collaborations. As a final thought, One child welfare worker who was participating in a consultation session described, "Improving child welfare services to immigrant families must not be viewed as a boutique issue. It must be part of the current, larger conversation regarding improving the overall child welfare system to meet our mandate of safety, permanency, and well-being."